Okay, so let's continue. I just created this super simple HTML that I called it measures, just to show you an example with all of the relative measures, so that by doing that we are completely sure that we understand how all of them work. Okay, so here in this file I just have this div that, as we said before, is like a generic container. I will set an ID to this div so that I can apply rules, CSS rules, specifically to that value. And I will say this will be called my container. Okay. And then here I created a new CSS. I imported the new CSS. And now I want to say let me check something. First of all, what's different here from what I did before? This character, no? Why do you think I use this one? Because with the class I use the dot, so dot and the name of the class. With the ID I use this one, okay? That's why. So let's see if it works. Let me check something. That's my container. Okay, so it's the same. Okay, so here I have the same website now with the same dimensions. So just to make sure that we understand how it works, we will try to set a width for that very simple, stupid container, okay? So the first ones, or the last ones that were on the slide, that are maybe the simple ones, are I forgot the name. This one, no? So what happened with this one? It is occupying the 50% of the available space, of the window available space. So if I see it here in the preview, I can barely notice that this one is the 50% of the whole space that I have in this window, okay, in that viewport. And if I take a look in the browser, now I know that it occupies the 50% of the available space in the window, in the browser, okay? Now, if instead of this I use Waka. In this case, it should be like the 50% of the height of the available space in the window. What happens here? Well, let me check something. Here, what happens is that our website is just occupying this space. I mean, the whole space is this one. So it doesn't have like any available space to grow. When we will update like the root element height, we will see that this height will also grow, okay? Then we have like this percentage, which at the beginning might seem the same as the viewport, the one that we used before. What's the difference with this one? That this one is related to the parent component. So if, for instance, I change the width of the body, to 50%, you know, this one now becomes 25%. Because the parent element when the parent element, the width is just 50%, then the width of the inner element is relative to its parent, okay? While in this case, it is not relative to the parent, but relative to the whole window. Then we have this, that is relative to the font size, as we saw before. Then we have the other one. Is this more or less right, the differences between each kind of measure, of relative measure? Do you have any questions? Does it work for all of you? Okay. So now we have already seen this in practice, but just to review, there are different types of selectors. We can select elements in different ways. So one of them, the simple one that we have already used, is by specifying to which element do we want to apply a given style. So in this case, for instance, the selector corresponds to an HTML element. So it might be div, it might be p, it might be footer, whatever, always pointing to an HTML element. What's the other way of using a selector? With the class, no? So one of them is to all of the elements of a given type. The other one is to the elements that belong to that specific class. We have already seen this in practice, but here just to show you an example. So we have this paragraph element that belongs to a class blue text. Therefore, when I said point blue text, it means apply this rule to the elements that belong to that class, okay? And then we can apply them to a specific element by using or by means of the ID. In the case of the ID, it changes the syntax because it's not the dot, the name of the class anymore, but it is the, how do you call this character in English? Hashtag, yeah. Okay, okay. So we use this one and then the name of the element of the ID. Okay. As you have already seen so far, the name that we want or that we need to assign to the classes, to the IDs, is completely up to us. It doesn't have any restrictions on that, but of course it would be better if we try to give names that make some sense, so that we can identify what are we talking about. And then there are some more advanced, complicated combinations of selectors. The first one, I will explain them to you here in the snippet. So the first one applies to all of the elements that within them have an attribute called href. Okay. The second one is for all of the elements that within them have defined an attribute with a specific value. No? So it is not anymore if they just have an whatever href, but if their href corresponds to this specific value. Okay. There are more advanced ones, that is, if within the href they have this substring, like .it. In which case this might be useful, but I don't know. It is kind of, if I want, for instance, all of the links pointing to Italian websites to have the green color, then I could do by using this selector. And the same thing. It ends with IT, it starts with some substring, or it contains within the value of the attribute and a specific substring. Honestly, these ones are not used very much because, well, as I told you before, it's difficult to find a specific case in which this might be super necessary. But if we ever need something like that, we already know that we have this available, okay? And then we have this one that is especially useful when we have links. So have you ever seen that when you click on a link, it then changes the color? So you open a website and the link is maybe blue. Then once you click it for the first time, the next time you go back to the page, typically it is purple or something like that. So that behavior or that styling that is applied to the links based on if they are clicked, if they have already been clicked, if the cursor is over the links, that kind of styling is done through these attributes. Once again, they are not like the most used ones, but it's still good to know that such kind of behaviors and such kind of appearance can be changed. Okay, up to now, everything clear?
Can we have like a few, more than one link in the same HTML5 file?
More than one link within the same, sure. But what do you mean, something like? We're doing this one, right? Sure, because for instance, here I can duplicate this one. So that in this case,
like the link, for example, we have measures.css and
okay, like two CSS, sure. You can still have two of them. Yeah. For instance, this one. Measure. Yeah. And both of them apply. Yeah. Indeed, later when we will use our framework, we will have the CSS of our framework, but still we want to have our own CSS because we don't want to import or to use everything as it comes out from the framework, but maybe we want to do some customizations. So our customizations to the way that the framework is built are done through our own CSS file. Okay? Now, this is important. This is very useful, and it has to do. It concerns how the selectors can be used. So up to now, we have seen that we have used like one element, comma, and then the second element. Okay. How do you read that, or how do you interpret that? It selects all. In this case, for instance, in the snippet, it selects all of the div elements and all of the p elements. Which is, okay, all of the div elements and the p elements. What's the difference between the first one and the second one? In the second one, it doesn't have the comma, right? So what does it change conceptually? That in this case, it is all of the p elements that are within a div element, okay? So it is not anymore all of the p elements, all of the div, but all of the p elements within a div element. That should be this one, the red one. No? You see the red one? It just applies to the p elements that are within a div element. Okay? So it is not to all of the p elements anymore, because for instance, these ones wouldn't be taken in this case, but it is for the p elements within a div element. Then the third one, how do we read this one? Here we have this character that says apply this style to the p element that is a direct child of a div element. So in this case, for instance, this one applies because this one is a direct child of div, okay? So it will apply it, I'm sorry, this one, the blue one, because these ones are direct childs of div, okay? The parents of those elements is a div, so it applies directly to them, and it doesn't apply to this one. Why? Because in this case, the direct parent of these two elements is a section, okay, not a div. Then there are other more strange, but that anyway can be useful, such as select the first element that is placed immediately after the div elements. In this case is this one. So the first element that is there after the div element. So not within, it is not a child of the div element, but it is the element immediately after the div. And then we have this one that is all the elements that are preceded by a p element. Okay? Yeah.
Why do we have to usually create an A or an if for everything we write?
Because these ones can be, on the one hand, you can reuse code, and this way can be more powerful. And the real answer is because up to now we're writing the page from scratch, so it is a very static web page. No? We already know what we will set in the page. But then when we will see that our page is going to create dynamically based on the information that we get from the database, so that is information that it is not under our control, that we won't be writing all of the HTML, but the HTML will be generated based on some data, then we want something more dynamic like this. No? For instance, let's think of an example. If I'm trying to build like the classifica, like the list of something, and I want the first element in the list to have some color, the second one a different one, and the third one a different one, and I still don't know which those values will be, then my only way to set that configuration is through a dynamic selector like this one. I still don't have the element because the HTML will populate with data that you will get from the backend. So you have to set them dynamically. You're welcome. Yeah, it is not very, I mean, I can't think of many examples in which you can use them, but I promise that at some point you will use them, okay? Also because, of course, up to now, our web page is like 5 lines long, 5 code lines long. But when it gets a lot of elements, it gets a lot of contents, then managing all of them through IDs or by classes at some point gets difficult to manage. Okay. Okay, now, do you remember that the last time that we saw that I told you was important was the display? That we say that by default, some elements have the block display, which means they will try to occupy all the space. But that by some means, we can change that default, that default configuration through a property that is called display. So let's try to think, to replicate into code and see how it works. So for instance, here in the slides, the list is something that by default behaves as has a display block, which means it will try to occupy all of the space it will have available. Let's see what happens if we change that display. So here we have the list, right? All the elements in the list. I always play with this background color, not because it's nice, but just to make it visible how much space it is occupying. So if sometimes you need to know or to get sure of how many space an element is occupying in the screen, you can use the background color, okay? So in this case, for instance, we can see that the list elements are display elements. How do we know they are the block elements? They have a block display. How do we know that? Because they are occupying all the space, okay? All the line space, and then the next element starts in the line below. What should I do if I want to change that display? Display in line. What happened with this display in line? So that the elements don't occupy anymore all of the available space, but that they occupy just the space they are using, and the next element is not placed below, but the next element is placed next to them to the right of the element, okay? Does it make sense? So for instance, in many websites where you see that they have that, like the navigation bar, they build the navigation bar with a list, and then they set this property to inline in such a way that all of the links are placed horizontally, one next to the other one. And of course, by doing this, it changes the page layout. So in the previous one, you saw that it occupied a lot of space. In the new one, it occupies just a row. Then we can play with this display property. So if we want to hide an element, we can use display none. So if you have there the CSS, try to write instead of display inline, write display none, and let's see what happens. So here it was in line. By default, it was block display, and if I write here none, the element disappears. Okay? Why do you think it's useful to use that display none? Sure, because there are some elements that we want to show dynamically depending on something. If I clicked here, then I want to show for instance, the image gallery. That happens a lot. That in the websites, when you click see images, it opens like a pop-up window that is not always visible, but just when something happens. Also, for instance, sometimes when you put the cursor over a link, it displays like a sub-menu that is just visible when you have the mouse over there. So that kind of behaviors are possible we can implement such kind of behaviors with the display none. And then there is also this property that is called visibility. And then you tell me the difference with display none. And here is hidden. What's the difference with display none? Yeah, the space is kept there. So it just hides the element, but the space is still there. In the other one, it is like it erases the element. Okay? Why this one might be useful? Because maybe we want to make sure that the layout of our website stays always the same, even if I'm showing or not an element. And in case where the element is being shown, I want it to go and fill that space. So in that case, instead of using display none, I would use visibility hidden. Okay. One very important thing in this web development journey and course is to understand that there are not like fixed rules. Everything depends. Everything depends on what you want to build. Everything depends on how do you want something to be displayed. Everything depends on however you want to do the things. So here, the important thing is to understand that you have possibilities to customize the interface, and then which rule do you want to use, which property do you want to use. It's up to you, depending on the website that you want to build. Is this clear? Perfect. So now we will already saw this, but once again, when we apply the CSS, what is completely forbidden, that is a very bad practice, is to apply the CSS in this way. Like to mix the CSS rules within the HTML document is completely wrong. So we will never do it in this way. We will always have our CSS documents, and we will import them from the HTML, and we will define everything into other documents. This one could be an alternative, but it's still very dirty alternative, because somehow we are doing everything within the same file. That is not a good practice. I mean, in software engineering, the best practice is to try to split concerns among different kinds of files. So the concern of how the page will look is assigned to the CSS files. The concern of how the page will be structured is applied or is assigned to the HTML documents. So by splitting the concerns, the idea is that we always have CSS documents on the one side and HTML documents on the other side. And the one that we like, that is the one that we have already seen. Just to clarify, this first attribute, the rel attribute, this one, it is always a style sheet, okay? So If what you are trying to import is a CSS, you always write it in this way, okay? In lowercase, style sheet, rel equal quotes, style sheet, and that's all. Okay, so the best practice is to use an external CSS for better maintainability and reusability, and we had already seen in practice. Okay, just to say, now the next topic has to do with something that is called the box model. I would prefer not to go deep into this topic today because it's important, and I would like to have you like more awake to take this topic. So I will just say briefly, conceptually, what it means, but then next time we will take a look in deeper and in practice of what this means. It basically has to do with the fact that, as you might have already noticed, all of the elements here in HTML and CSS are boxes. No? Have you seen that everything is a rectangle? So the container is a rectangle. When we set the background color, we see that the list is also a rectangle that occupies all the window. We have seen that the footer is a rectangle. Everything is a rectangle. Okay? So everything is a box. So when we are trying to position everything, to set the dimensions to every element in the HTML, we have to think as if we were trying to play with boxes. In these boxes, we have like several common properties. One of them, for instance, is the margin. As you can see in this diagram. So what is the margin? This is a distance from the border of the element and the other elements, no? So that if I want, for instance, my link to have some space with the next link, or my list, an element in my list to have a space with the next element, or if I want my container to have an outer space, an outer margin, then I use this margin property, okay? Then I have the border, that the border, well, as its own name says, the border. There I can play with the how thin the border would be, or how big it would be, with the color, also with the style of the border, because maybe I want a border like this that is solid, or maybe I want a border like this that has like the dots. So I can also play with that property. Then there is another property that is the padding, no? What's the difference between the margin and the padding? That the margin is a space out of the border, the padding is a space within the border. So the margin is the space that I want to have between the border and the next element in the HTML, and the padding is the space that I want to have between the border and the content of the element, of the content of that box, okay? And then here I finally have the content, okay? So based on this, if we want to calculate what's like the whole width or height of any element in the HTML, we would say that it is the height of the content plus the top padding, that is the space between the content and the border, plus the bottom padding, that is the margin. It is this one plus this one plus the size of the border plus the size of the margin, okay? This is nothing very difficult, it's not, but it's something just to have in mind, especially later that you will try to set up the dimensions and to set up the layout, to have always in mind that all of these measures have an impact. Sometimes you will say, why does this element doesn't have enough margin? Or why does this element overflows the window? Then in that case you have to reason and to check if the padding plus the margin are going out of the limits that you want, and try to understand or to play with that variables, okay? Then we have the positioning. Have you seen that up to now our website or our HTML basically looks as a Word document? It is super bored because it's as if it were like a text document. Everything is going from top to bottom, and we are not playing with the positioning of the elements. We are not placing any element on the left side. We are not placing any element one next to the other one. So up to now it's super bored. But for doing that, we have the positioning schemes that they are static. That is, indeed. What do you think this static is based on this diagram without reading the description? The elements are placed relative to the browser. No? So I set a position, and depending on how much space does the browser have or the window have, the elements will be placed there. This one, the relative one, what do you think it is? Relative to the parent element, no? So it is not fixed or relative to the whole browser, but to the element that contains him. This one that is absolute is also, I set a value that it will always be the same. If I say 2020, then I know that my element will be placed at 20 pixels left, 20 pixels down from the top corner of the browser. It doesn't change anything if I open from the cell phone, from the different browser. It always remains that absolute value. And then there is the fixed one that is related to the viewport, and it remains also fixed there. The difference with the absolute one is if I scroll down, it is still there. Okay. Maybe it comes to my mind. For instance, this one might be something like that, no? That even if I scroll down, the element keeps there. Why does it keep it there, or what's the sense of keeping this here? Because it's the element that helps me to go up. Indeed, this element is, well, I don't know how this website is implemented, but this one is interesting because we have seen the display none, no? And the visibility hidden. So there, at this point, you can see that this element is hidden. We're not able to see the element because we don't need to go up. Then if we go down, this is happening because of JavaScript is running, and JavaScript detects when we get to a given point and changes the rule of this element, changes the CSS of this element, or applies a new CSS rule to this element. So it detected that we got to this point in the scrolling of the website, and it changed possibly the display property of this element, making it visible. No? And then also it is interesting to see that this element its position is, I'm almost sure that must be something like this fixed. No? If it were not fixed, what would happen? That when I go down, it would disappear. Let's try to make a so here you see position fixed. Okay. What was the other one? Position fixed. Here is super nice also with this vector that you can change some things. Of course, it will just change in your browser. You won't be doing any change to the website. But just in your browser to play and to experiment with the properties. For instance, I change this position to absolute, and what happened? I lost it. Ah, no, here. No, the problem with this one is that here, no? Okay, so this one is here. Why it changed? Because I set an absolute position to that button, but when the scroll goes down, it keeps on that position. I mean, it is, let's try to think, it is pasted to the page. So when the page goes up, it is there. With the fixed one, let's try to think as if it were like in a different layer. It's not pasted to the page, so when the page goes up, it still keeps on the same position. Okay. In this case, it's somehow difficult to show you the behavior, because there is also the JavaScript that is running behind and is not enabling us to see the element all the time. But it is basically like that. Okay.
So, for example, the letter in this is static, since even if we scroll, it doesn't.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, this one, for instance. Yeah. Let's try to think to see how it is built. Rob. Position relative. Well, in this case, they wrote it as relative, but it also depends on the container of that header, because we don't know how they structure everything. So yeah, in this case, it worked with relative, but maybe it is because the container, the parent of him, is static or something like that. Okay. But yeah, in some cases, we can see some patterns here and try to identify how they behave based on how they look. Okay, also, to give you an example of how this works in code, it is always a class written in this way, in which we define for each element that we want to set a position, the kind of position that we want to give, and the distance between the element and the left margin, and between the element and the top margin, such as in this case. As I told you before, it doesn't make so much sense to go deep into this, also because I want to prepare a template where we can easily play with that the next class, so that I can upload that template, you can download, and next class we can easily play with that, so that it could be more easy to see them. And then there is another kind of positioning that has to do with the zeta index, that is if the element is shown behind another one, or if it is shown above a different element. Okay, so we can play with the stack order of the elements. Like we have just seen in the Politos page, no? We have the button that goes down, and it is like the first one, and all of the content is behind. So if we try to think it's like in the 3 dimensions, it will be the button here and the page scrolling up or down behind that button element. And this is achieved through this property that is called the zeta index. Okay, and the last thing that I want to show you today, just to motivate you, because because as I said to you before, up to now we are seeing just like the basics, no? So our websites or what we have been building right now is not super exciting. But then, once we get familiar with how the CSS works, with all the rules that we have available, we will use this library. That is, I don't know if any of you already know it. Yeah. Okay. So what is this library basically? It is basically a CSS, a huge CSS document that someone has built for us and that we can use and integrate in our website, so that doing everything is not as painful as thinking of all of the properties that we have to define for an element, or that we don't have to build a header from scratch, or that we don't have to build or think of all of the possible properties to build footer. Why? Because someone has already tried to implement and to abstract all the possible, not all the possible, but most of the possible CSS styles that we will need. Of course, we won't go deep into this topic neither, because it's like the next topic, after the, not the next class, but the one after that. But I just wanted to show you that, for instance, here in the documentation of the library, you can find, for instance, components, no? And here we have this accordion component. So if we want, let's try to find a more interesting one than the accordion. For instance, the cards, no? Something like this. In our site, we want to implement something like this, like a card with a description and a button that takes us to some portion of the site, or something like this. What are we going to do, or how are we going to use this framework? Basically, by copy-pasting this HTML and by importing the classes, no? So this is just to say that by using Bootstrap, we easily can be building something that looks more like this. At least the structure. Of course, then we will customize all of the elements, add colors, and, but at least the structure will get more closer to this one. The reason why we are not still here is because we need to understand the basis, we need to understand how it works, so that we can then customize how the framework and the library behaves in our website. But that's what we are, the direction we are heading to, okay? So my proposal is today we stop here, and next time when we are more fresh, more awake, we will work on the CSS box model and well, the most advanced aspects of CSS. Do you have any questions up to now? Is it everything clear? Is it clear how CSS works? Perfect. So let's stop here and see you on Monday.